In the last video, we saw that thoughts appear spontaneously when we attend to our direct experience. They do not present themselves as something we actively produce. Today, I want to continue our investigation by taking a closer look at language. Even though not all thoughts appear as language, many of them do, and much of our thinking takes place in the form of language. It is typically the medium in which our thinking is structured. So, if we want to understand thinking more clearly, it is quite necessary to examine the medium in which it takes place. And to do this, I'll use a few different philosophers to look at language from different angles. Ferdinand de Saussure, Jacques Derrida, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Martin Heidegger. Some of this will be a bit technical, but I'll try to make it as clear as I can. So let's get straight into it. First of all, notice that language existed before you were born. It doesn't matter what your native language is, you are not the one who invented it. You did not invent the words that you use. You did not invent the grammar. You did not invent the categories. You picked it up when you were a child, and from that point on, you simply use it. Every verbal thought that you have is made out of these elements, so whatever appears to you in thought is already articulated in a certain way. But what kind of thing is language? What does it mean for a word to mean anything at all? A common assumption is that language functions as a system of signs used to represent a world that is already there. Words as labels attached to things. So there's an object in the world over there, I stick a label on it and I call it a table or an apple or whatever else. In this view, language is just a tool that we use to describe the world. But this may not be an accurate view of what language is, and it is precisely the assumption that Ferdinand de Saussure calls into question. In Course on General Linguistics, Saussure writes, "In language, there are only differences. Even more important, a difference generally implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. But in language, there are only differences without positive terms. Whether we take the signified or the signifier, language has neither ideas nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. The idea of phonic substance that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it. Proof of this is that the value of a term may be modified without either its meaning or its sound being affected, solely because a neighboring term has been modified." This is a dense passage, but his central point is relatively simple. Saussure is saying that language is not made up of independently meaningful elements. There are no positive terms, no words that carry meaning independently by themselves. There are only differences. A word means what it does only because it is different from other words, not because it corresponds to something in the world in a direct and self-sufficient way. And you can see this very easily if we look at an example. Take the word day. It only means what it does because it is different from night. If there were no contrast, if there were no night, then day wouldn't have the same meaning. Or take colors. What red is depends on how it differs from other colors, from orange, from pink, from brown, right? So the meaning is not inside the word, it comes from the relations. But Saussure makes this even more radical by saying that there are no fully formed ideas that exist before language waiting to be expressed. And there are no sounds that already carry meaning. So both the conceptual side and the material side of language are formed within the system itself. Saussure points out that the value of a term can change even if the concept it refers to and its sound remain the same, simply because the surrounding terms change. So the meaning of a word is not fixed, but it depends on the structure of the system as a whole. And that is why Saussure is often considered a founding figure of what is called structuralism. The idea that meaning is not grounded in individual elements, but in the structure of relations between them. If we follow him here, thinking can no longer be understood as a process in which you first have clearly formed ideas and then simply put them into words. The distinctions that language provides are already structuring how something can appear to you as an idea in the first place. So when you think, you're not just using language as a tool, you are operating within a system of differences that you did not create and that organizes what can appear to you as meaningful in advance. Now, Derrida pushes this even further by looking more closely at what in linguistics is called the sign. In the classical picture, a sign has two sides. On the one hand, there is the signifier, the word, the sound, the mark. On the other hand, there is the signified, the concept, what we take the word to mean. So, for example, the word tree would be the signifier, and the concept of a tree would be the signified. And the idea is that these two belong together. The signifier expresses the signified. Derrida focuses on the second part of this relation because the signified is usually treated as something that's stable and that can stand on its own and give the sign its meaning. And this is where Derrida sees a problem. In Of Grammatology, he writes, "The signified concept is never present in itself, in an adequate presence that would refer only to itself." What this means is that what we call a concept is never simply there as something self-contained. The moment you try to determine what something means, you are already referring to something else. And you can see this if you think of a dictionary. If you look up a word, you get a definition, but that definition is made up of other words. And if you then look up those words, you get further definitions, again in terms of other words. And obviously, this process can continue indefinitely. And this is not a limitation of dictionaries. It shows us something about language itself, namely that meaning does not come to rest in a final term. It is always referred onward, never fully present in itself. This is what Derrida calls différence. He deliberately constructs this term from the French verb différer, which means both to differ and to defer, as in to postpone. And in French, the difference between différence and différence is not audible. It only appears in writing. So what we have then is not a system in which meanings are fixed, but a process in which every determination depends on further distinctions that open into further distinctions without ever coming to rest. So there's no final term that would bring this process to an end. And this is where Derrida moves beyond Saussure. Saussure describes a structure of differences, but Derrida shows that this structure cannot be understood as a closed system that would stabilize itself. That's why he's often called a post-structuralist. The distinction between signifier and signified can no longer serve as a stable foundation. The signified is not something that would fix meaning once and for all, because it is itself caught in the same movement of differences. So the idea that a word could have a meaning that simply is what it is, fully given and independent of further relations, cannot be maintained. So when you take yourself to mean something, that meaning is never simply there, fully given. It always slips beyond anything you can fix once and for all. And this is what Derrida means when he says, there is nothing outside the text. He does not mean that nothing exists outside of language. He means that whatever appears as meaningful, anything you can understand, interpret, or think, does not stand outside this movement of signification. There is no place outside this where meaning could finally be fixed as something fully present. So the question is no longer just what words mean, but how anything can appear as meaningful at all. What does it mean for something to be sayable or thinkable? You may have heard this famous dictum by the early Wittgenstein. Die Grenzen meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenzen meiner Welt. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. If meaning depends on distinctions that are already in place, then what becomes available to you at all is tied to those distinctions. Try to hold something in mind without already determining what it is in some way, without placing it within a set of differences. You will find that this is impossible. As soon as something becomes clear enough to be thought, it has already taken on a form that can be articulated. And that form is not independent of language. So the limits that Wittgenstein talks about are not something you encounter at the edge of language. They are already at work in what appears to you. So whatever becomes present to you as something, as a thing, a property, a relation, is already articulated in a certain way. A world is not simply there, waiting to be described. It becomes available through these articulations. And these articulations are not something that you began, they are already in place. Up to this point, it still looks like there are two things. On the one hand, a human being, and on the other hand, language. Even if language shapes thought, even if it limits what can appear, the basic picture remains the same. First, there is a subject, and then it uses language. But Heidegger puts this whole picture into question. He begins with a very simple sentence. Der Mensch spricht. The human being speaks. That sounds trivial, but Heidegger asks, what does this actually mean? Do we just mean that the human being has among other abilities, the capacity to speak? He says no. Erst die Sprache befähigt den Menschen, dasjenige Lebewesen zu sein, das er ist. Language is what first enables the human being to be the living being that it is. So we cannot start from a human being that is already fully there and then add language to it. Language is not a tool we possess. It is not one capacity among others. It is bound up with what it means to be human in the first place. So Heidegger rejects the idea that language is expression, that there is something inner, a thought, a meaning, and language simply brings it out. He describes this common view very explicitly. Sprechen ist die Betätigung der Werkzeuge der Verlautbarung und des Gehörs. Sprechen ist das lautliche Ausdrücken und Mitteilen menschlicher Gemütsbewegungen. Speaking is the activity of the organs of speech and hearing. Speaking is the audible expression and communication of human inner states. This is the standard picture. There is something inside, and language expresses it outwardly. But Heidegger says this picture is not simply wrong, but it does not get at what is essential, because it already assumes that meaning is there in advance and that language only transmits it. So instead of starting from expression, he asks us to remain with language itself. Wir wollen nicht die Sprache überfallen, sie in den Griff schon festgemachter Vorstellungen zu zwingen. We do not want to assault language in order to force it into the grasp of already fixed concepts. Der Sprache selbst und nur ihr möchten wir nachdenken. We want to think after language itself and only it. So the task is not to define language, not to explain it in terms of something else, but to attend to it, to stay with it. And then Heidegger says something that sounds almost absurd. Die Sprache ist Sprache. Die Sprache spricht. Language is language. Language speaks. This is a great example of why Heidegger is so notoriously difficult to translate, because what he's doing here really depends on the German. Die Sprache spricht. You can hear it. Sprache spricht. In English, language speaks sounds almost like a mistake, as if we were saying that language does something that only a person can do. But in German, the verb sprechen and the noun Sprache belong to the same root. So the sentence folds back onto itself. It's not just making a claim, it is drawing attention to speaking itself. The sentence is meant to make us hear language itself. At first, this sounds like a tautology or even nonsense. Of course we speak, not language, because we understand speaking as something we do, as an activity of a subject, and language accordingly as something at our disposal. To see more clearly what Heidegger is pointing to here, it helps to look at how he analyzes a poem, a short poem by Georg Trakl called Ein Winterabend, a winter evening. And it begins like this. Wenn der Schnee ans Fenster fällt, lang die Abendglocke läutet. When the snow falls against the window, the evening bell tolls long. Now, the usual way to understand this would be that the poem describes a scene: snow, a bell, a house, and language represents what is there. But Heidegger says that is not what is happening.
Das Nennen verteilt nicht Titel, verwendet nicht Wörter, sondern ruft ins Wort. Das Nennen ruft. Naming does not distribute labels, does not merely use words, but calls into the word. Naming is a calling.
When something is named, it is not just designated, it is brought into a certain kind of presence. So the poem is not simply describing snow and a bell, it is letting them appear, letting them come into nearness. And Heidegger goes even further. He says that in this naming, it is not just individual things that appear, but something like a world.
Die Dinge versammeln Himmel und Erde, die Sterblichen und die Göttlichen. The things gather earth and sky, mortals and the divine.
This is Heidegger's poetic way of saying, in language, things are not isolated objects. They show up within a whole context of meaning, within a world. So language is not just a system of signs, and it is not just expression. It is that in which things come to appear within a world at all. So for Heidegger, this is not just a point about language, but about how a world comes to appear at all. So when Heidegger says, die Sprache spricht, language speaks, he is not making a claim in the usual sense. He is saying language is not primarily something we control. It is not something we stand over against. Rather, we already stand within it. Speaking is not just an activity we perform. It is something we are always already involved in. And this is what he means by thinking after language.
Der Sprache nachdenken heißt, bei der Sprache den Aufenthalt nehmen.
To think after language means to take up a dwelling within language. So what follows from all this? Are you still with me? The idea that thinking belongs to you and that language is just a tool you use to express it just doesn't hold up. What you call a thought does not first exist on its own and then gets put into words. It already takes shape within distinctions you did not create, within a system that shapes what can appear as meaningful, within relations that never fully settle, and within a world that is already articulated before you begin to speak. When a thought appears, it does not begin with you. It takes place within a structure that is already here. You move within it. You rely on it. You are formed by it. Thinking does not simply belong to you. It takes place within language, but not as something fully determined by it. That means the way things appear to you, the way you understand them, is already shaped in advance, within a structure that was already there before you began to think. But that structure did not simply appear out of nowhere. So how did the way we think today take shape? Why do things appear to us, for example, true or false, or good or bad, normal or abnormal? Why do we divide the world up in these ways and not in entirely different ones? These are the questions that we will be exploring in the next video. All right, that's all I have for you today. We covered a lot of ground here, and it takes some real effort to think this through carefully. These are not easy ideas, so if you've stayed with it this far, you genuinely have my respect. If you have any questions, or if there's something you're not quite convinced by, I'd really be interested to hear that. If you're curious to explore more of what I'm doing, you can also check out my blog. The link is in the video description. And with that, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.